Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally happy to be here. This is episode 183 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We are both delighted that you have joined us, and we're going to be looking at three different topics today, starting with our student check-in, where we take something that a student is likely to come across during their training journey. And today we're going to be speaking about keeping in the client's frame of reference, not behind the client, not in front of them, keeping in their frame of reference. And I think that's going to apply also to our qualified colleagues as well. A nice revisit of that. We then jump into Digital Counselling Revolution, where we're going to be speaking about choosing a video background. If you're working via video technology when you're counselling, what's behind you? What does that look like? And then we're going to be going into practice matters, where we take something that would come up in the day-to-day running of a counselling practice for our qualified practitioners. And we've got Emily Mitchell, who's going to be speaking to us with Rory today about research in online counselling, and that's what that is telling us. So we start off with our student check-in, keeping in the client's frame of reference. Rory, I think we start by, what is a frame of reference?
Well, a frame of reference is how we view the world. So one of the things I would do when I used to be training counsellors many years ago is get two of the students to look out of a window, and I would say to them, out of the window of the classroom, and I'd say, just on your own, just make notes of what you can see, and then I'd sit them down and I'd say, what do you see? And usually what would happen is the two of them would see different things. They're looking out of the same window, yes, but they're seeing different things. And that is frame of reference. It's a phenomenological process in that we can have the same, literally the same experience, or be in the same position, but the person next to us has a different view of things. So that is frame of reference, Ken.
Yeah, nice one. So being in the client's frame of reference, I guess, is taking that one step further. So what we learn in counselling is that we want to kind of not have our frame of reference contaminate the counselling timeline. So if a client is bringing some information, if we're relating to how that affected us in our experience in our life, that's kind of our frame of reference. And I guess it's about being in that client's frame of reference, Rory. And how do we do that?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, Ken, and it's one that has come up in our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll see us. We are a closed group, but knock on the door. Of course, we're going to let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We've got students, we've got qualified colleagues, supervisors. We've also got tutors. So come on in. We want to see you, and you can come and join a really exciting party. And to answer your question, Ken, how do we go into this, stay in the client's frame of reference, or if you're working with a peer in skills, there are some useful applications of skills, and I think the first skill that we use is silence. We allow the client or the person we're listening to speak. And I think a very good rule is the one of Marcus Aurelius: we have two ears and one mouth, so we can listen twice as much as we speak. So the first thing is listening, making sure that you're hearing and that you're not putting over your opinion, you're hearing them. So that's the first rule, Ken.
I like that. And silence, I know from being a tutor and having maybe new students who are kind of just learning the counselling skills, silence can feel uncomfortable at first. Almost feels like it needs to be filled. And I think what you're saying, Rory, is being silent as the counsellor and engaging in active listening. So you would be using the skill of silence, not looking for any pause or break in what the client may be bringing to fill it with what your thoughts are on what they've said, but you would just be allowing that space, allowing the client, I guess, to move at their own pace and set the pace of the interaction with you. And I guess when we're listening to that, we listen empathically. And what do we mean by empathically? is we try to see what the client is bringing from their frame of reference. We're back at that frame of reference. How is that client seeing that and experiencing that, as opposed to how are we hearing that material and interpreting it ourselves? So there's the real skill. Within that silence, there is that thought, maybe not much is happening from the counsellor during that silence, but it's like a duck. On the top, it looks all smooth, but underneath, it's the little legs are going because you're working really hard to be in that client's frame of reference, to understand it as they understand it, as they're telling it.
Absolutely, Ken. And of course, the next skill to think about, or element within in the relationship, is how you use questions. Generally speaking, when you're working with anyone therapeutically, try only to use questions to clarify. This is particularly pertinent if you're working in a person-centered way, where you are just using questions just to clarify your understanding. So don't bombard clients with questions. Don't bombard them and ask one after the other, stack questions up. Is it like this, or does it feel like that? Only use questions just to clarify your understanding. So when people speak, they may talk about lots of things that are going on for them. I'm making reference to things only they'll know. We might say, he said this or she said that. And it might be useful to say, I've heard that you've said he and he. I just wonder who he is, so I understand. And that gives you a clarity, and you're better able to get closer to what the client is speaking about and their understanding.
Yes. So we're basically taking curiosity out of asking. Think about when we ask a question generally outside of a therapeutic environment. We're asking a question because we're curious. We want to find out a little bit more or know a little bit deeper of something that is being brought. However, when we're using therapeutic questioning in this case, as we're explaining it now, when we're working within that client's frame of reference, we're using the skill of questioning only to clarify our understanding, to check that we are in the client's frame of reference. I love the example you used there, Rory. You might have a client who says, my brother and my father really drive me mad, and he gets really angry sometimes. Now, as the counsellor hearing that, I'm going, he gets really angry. Is that the brother who gets angry? Or is that the father that gets angry? I'm no longer able to be in that client's frame of reference. And you're 100%, Rory. The question then, which is relevant, is when you say he, is that your brother or your father? And they will clarify it. And then you're back in their frame of reference. Oh, your brother gets really angry. Right, I'm now with you again. You might not say that out loud, but within the frame of reference, you're adjusting yourself back in, and you're using a question to clarify that you understand it correctly. And the client will correct you. They will bring you back within their frame of reference. I like this, Rory. What do we do next?
The next thing to consider is being patient. And patience is a big kind of attribute of being a therapist or a therapist in training. It might be that clients take a long time to speak about what's really going on for them, and you have to listen patiently and diligently to them. And eventually, if you show patience, what will happen is they will be able to speak about everything that's going on for them. I think if you appear impatient, or you appear a little quick to try and get the information out, it might be that they start to shut down. So learning patience and realizing that sometimes you can tell what's going on for them before they actually speak to you about it. But it's not about mind reading or second guessing. It's about reflecting back what they are saying. So sometimes we have to be patient, and they will get to it in their own time. I think that's probably one of the toughest skills to learn, just to be patient and learn how to wait.
Yeah, I agree with you. That silence, not saying anything, only clarifying your understanding, and then being infinitely patient with what that client is bringing. These are tricky skills, really, when you put them together. And that patience is really about being in the client's frame of reference. The client is going to bring the information that they feel safe to bring at the time that they feel safe to bring it. And there can be temptation, I guess, to pounce on or be like a freight train going dun, 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 to we've got to get to this pain, we've got to get to this thing, this is where the issue is, we're going to sort this out. Like you say, Rory, as the therapist, you may be seeing what's really going on for the person. They may even verbalize it. It's not unusual for a client to come into a first session and to bring out a lot of information in that first session. The client may well, I'm just using an example here, they may say, I'm in an abusive relationship. That might not come up again for many sessions. They might only revisit that in session 6. And we as the therapist, it's not for us on session 3 to go, when you first came in, you mentioned such a thing, and bringing that back in. It's about being patient that the client will bring that, if they feel safe enough to bring that information, in the time that suits them. And I agree with you, Rory, tricky, because we're fighting against our own frame of reference here, and we all go into counseling because we want to help, we want to serve the client, and we can sometimes see that serving the client is getting to that information, working through it so that you'll be free of it. But we can't do that. And there's a lovely kind of little saying or anecdote that you share, Rory, about a flower opening. Can you just share that with us just for a moment?
Yes, I mean, it's been mentioned in literature a lot about the analogy is sometimes butterfly wings, butterflies emerging from the cocoon, that you could break the cocoon open and see the butterfly before it's ready to come out, but you might damage the wings. I think the best analogy is written by John Schleen, who was one of Roger's students, and he talked about the poppy field. He would go to the poppy field once a year, and he would literally know the day the poppy opened, and he would patiently sit and wait for the poppy to open, the leaves to peel themselves back and show the poppy in all its glory. And he reflected that, yes, he could force the leaves, but he might damage them. And I think that is so important. Our clients are like, like the butterfly, like the poppy. They're closed off, and our job is to sit and wait for them to flower, to flourish, to open, so we can see the clients and they can see themselves in all their glory. We mustn't rush that process.
Oh, I like that, Rory, and that's why I wanted to bat that over, because every time I hear it, it gives me little goosebumps. So what we've looked at so far is the client being in their frame of reference, kind of letting them set the pace of the sessions. We've got the silence that we're using here. We're only asking questions to clarify our understanding, make sure we're in that client's frame of reference. We're being patient and allowing the client to develop their narrative and bring out the feelings in their own time. We're not forcing those petals open, as it were. So what else might we consider here, Rory?
Well, I think working at the client's pace, I think that's really, really, really important. And I think one of the ways to think about it is, think of you and the client going on a lovely walk in the countryside. And in fact, some qualified therapists may actually do this. But if you're in a room or you're online with the client, think about taking a walk. The client leads, you're just slightly behind, and it's the client who sets the direction, and you just follow the direction. And I think it's easy, certainly in first trainings, initial training, to just get in front of the clients and lead them. And that means that you're working from your frame of reference, not theirs. So just behind the clients, and as I'm saying this, I'm moving my hands, you can't see this, to show in front and behind. The client leads, you follow. You should be slightly behind the client, walking behind them, and allowing them to set the direction of what they want to talk about and what they want to explore.
I think that's a really good revisit of that topic, of a client setting the pace, of being in the client's frame of reference. And I want to go back to the window that you started with, Rory, where you would use that as an exercise for your counselling students, that you would stand two of them at a window, ask them to both look out of that window, and then to note down on a notepad what they saw, and then compare the notes and see how different that is. So if we take that into the real world of counselling and take what we've been learning today, it would be about standing at the window with the client, slightly behind them, and them telling you what they are seeing. And you block out what you're seeing. You only reflect back what they are seeing. And then you clarify, you first of all start off silently allowing them to say what they're seeing. You then clarify using clarifying questions only. So when they say, wow, I see a big tower out there, you might say, is it the church or the big office building? No, it's the church. So you can clarify their understanding of it. You are patiently with them without any agenda of your own. At no stage are you going to say, but can't you see the big train track running through? Because they haven't brought that. So we don't bring anything they don't bring. And I think that is a beautiful way, Rory, of kind of closing this off, starting with that very exercise that you train your counselling students using.
Absolutely. And I've created just a little handout, just as a checklist that you can put by yourself when you're doing your skills work, just to get those 4 points in. And to get that handout, you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, find episode 183, and it's waiting for you. Just download it and it'll land in your inbox.
So there you have it. We're now going to be moving on to our digital counselling revolution, where we're going to be speaking about what's behind you. If you're working via video and you've got the camera, what is being seen behind you while you're engaging in that client? And yes, we can also think about what might be behind that client as well. So we're going to dip in immediately to the digital counselling revolution.
Digital counselling revolution.
Yes, well, we're living in a world of online platforms, online video platforms, whether you're watching someone being interviewed on the TV or you're working online with a client. One of the consistent themes is that there's always a background. And when we're working online, we've got to be very, very thoughtful of both our background and, I guess, to some extent, be aware of the client's background. So the client is inviting you into their home. When you're working online, it's different to working face-to-face or in the room, because you're seeing a snapshot of the client's room. So first of all, if there is a background, you need to be very, very thoughtful not to comment on things in the background, because you're actually commenting on their home. And I think sometimes when you're working on video, you see things in the background and you're attracted to them, and you might say, oh, I see you've got a teapot or something like that. Avoid that, because that's the client's personal space. But more to the point, how do we manage our own backgrounds? And I think that when you're setting up your camera and your computer for video work, pay attention to your background. Have you got any family pictures there? Have you got anything that may distract the client? Try to find, I think, a neutral background. I also would say that you can actually get artificial backgrounds. A lot of video platforms now have a feature where you can do like a green screen, like they do in the movies, where you can have an artificial background behind you. And I think you need to be thoughtful of that, because obviously some artificial backgrounds may be inappropriate. I mean, with the platform that Ken and myself are using, one of the backgrounds is the Golden Gate Bridge in California. Now, clearly, it wouldn't be right for me to counsel someone with the Golden Gate Bridge in California behind me, because clearly I'm not in California, and that might be distracting, and I think it's a little disrespectful. But let me ask you this question, Ken. Is there a time where it may be useful to use an artificial background? And I'll give you a clue. Room safety, and the therapist might be in a different location. So it may be that someone moves house or is in a different location, and they may want to have a very good reason to have the same background in their video.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, and I definitely will get round to answering your question there, Rory, of what my thoughts are on that. But I think what's really important is you listening to this. What are your thoughts on that? I want to look at this from the point of view of there's two different sides to this. There's the client side and the client's background. And you've quite rightly said, Rory, the last thing we're going to do is say, oh, I can see you've got a trophy there behind. Well, what's that about? And if you go back to the first topic that we discussed in today's podcast, we speak about being in the client's frame of reference. It's not about our curiosity. It's about what the client is bringing. And also, we are mindful that the client may not see their home. It becomes invisible to them because they're living in it. It just kind of disappears. I don't walk around my home going, oh, look, there's my bookshelf. Oh, look, there's a picture of my daughter. I just walk around my home and it just is. It's almost like I don't see it. But when the client gets online with you, specifically if you're using video software, and I'm going to use an example, I'm going to say Zoom as an example. And there's different software available. Let's pretend you're using Zoom for a moment. All of a sudden, the client can see themselves differently. And all of a sudden, the client may be aware of the background that is behind them. It may be their home. It may be that they feel their home may be judged because they may feel that it's not as tidy as they would like it to be. So all different things can potentially come up for the client when they see their background almost for the first time, because they're logging into the video software for the first time, and then suddenly you're there with the counselor as well. So it's good practice to prepare the client beforehand, saying to them, you will be seen on the video, you will be seen, your background will be seen. So have a think of what room you might choose for where you want to do this. So you're kind of giving them a heads up. So as they're planning and getting ready for their call, they're thinking, right, I need to think about what's behind me now and the fact that I'm going to be seen on camera. So there is the opportunity to prepare them. Then coming to yourself as the counselor, I think this is a fun subject. And the reason I think it's such a fun subject is because I remember back in my training days, becoming a training to become a counselor, one of the exercises that we did was to plan what our counseling room might look like when we graduated. And I remember taking a piece of paper and drawing out my ideal counseling room and where everything would be placed. Well, the same is true as if you are working online and you're working via video, you get to plan what goes behind you. And if you think about the camera angle when you're working with video software, usually you have around 2 meters by 1.5 meters oblong behind you. That is the only area that can be seen on camera. So it gives you the opportunity to decorate that and add things to that as you feel. You're actually building your practice, but you're building your online practice. So there's an idea to think about.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, Ken. Going back to fundamentals, when we're students, and to some extent, and I don't want to be too incongruent about this. You're setting up a counselling room as your client would see it. And it might feel like you're setting up a film set. You're putting your background behind you, you're putting things into that would be like your therapy room. But this is in service of the client. Yeah. And also clients like consistency. If I'm counselling, when I was counselling face-to-face, and I may have to have another room because one room was booked out where I worked, I would always say to the client, I'm aware that we're in a different room. How does this feel for you? Because, being in the same room is part of security, part of safety. And it's very respectful, I think, to have a room that I read in a book a few years ago, and I can't remember. So, please no emails in the mailbag, please. I can't remember where the quote was from, but it said the room must give permission for the client to cry, must give permission for those emotions to come out. And I think, paying attention to your background is just so essential therapeutically. We have to think of it. So experiment, play around with it. Maybe get a view off a colleague before you go with a client. Yeah. Meet up with a colleague and have a look.
Yeah, well, I know that on our course, we run a course called Online and Telephone Counselling. It's a certificate in online and telephone counselling through Counselling Tutor. If you're interested in that, go to counsellingtutor.com. The info's on the page. But a lot of the students on that course do exactly that. They meet up with their buddy of the course, they buddy up during the course and say, what do you think of my background? How should I move that? And get feedback on that. And it's like you say, Rory, it's like designing the view into your counselling practice that your client will see. So we do take time and we do take care. But you asked me a question, Rory, and I said I would answer it. And the question you asked was, do you think that it is appropriate to use a fake background or a superimposed background? So as Rory mentioned, you can use video software to kind of put a background in for you. You use the Golden Gate Bridge, Rory. And I guess it's about service of the client. So one of the things we look at when we're speaking about counselling is we speak about congruence. Now, congruence is that things are true. They are as they are. You know, in the example you used, Rory, of having to work with someone in a different room, I had the same happen to myself, specifically in placement, when we were moved from room to room from time to time. And it would be about being congruent and saying, we're in a different room. How does that feel for you? If you are coming from a different place, you might be saying, I'm in a different location today, and I wonder how that is for you. And I'm mindful that it looks a little bit different behind me. Or you might use a virtual background and say to the client in the very first session, I use a virtual background because it gives consistency, and I wonder if you're okay with that. So they know there's a virtual background, so they're not sitting there thinking, you know what, every time he moves his hand, there's like a funny blur there and it looks a bit pixelated. Because to be honest with you, these virtual backgrounds are a little hit and miss at the best of times. In terms of how well they work. Now, you can get virtual backgrounds that work really, really well, but it depends on the lighting that you're using and the quality of your camera and its ability to basically cut you out from the background. And then if you go a step further, you can actually use specialized screens. It's called chroma keying, which allows the software to do a better job of putting in a virtual background. But even with the best of chroma key backgrounds, think about the weather forecast. They usually have a chroma key background behind them, and that's broadcast quality. Every now and then you'll see a little green tinge on somebody's hair or a bit of their clothing that looks a little bit weird or pixelated or see-through. So it can be spotted. So if you are going to use a background, there's no reason why you shouldn't use a computer-generated background, but be congruent with the client. Maybe tell them that so that they know that you're working with a background.
Yes, and also I would say practice with a buddy or a colleague with your background. There's a hilarious meme doing the rounds at the internet of an American senator who put a background up, and it was of a cat, and every time he spoke, the cat spoke his words. So if you are going to do that, absolutely make sure that the background you use is the background that the client will see, and be very thoughtful of it. And the reason I'm laughing is Ken has just put a background up on the video feed we're using, and he's sitting in a nice forest and he's waving his hands about ethereally with the aurora borealis in the background. But I actually can see part of his background. So backgrounds are your therapy room. I'll leave you with this parting thought. Backgrounds are your therapy room. You take care in your therapy room. You make sure that there's nothing that could be triggering for a client, nothing that could upset a client. Clients may even say to you, please don't put anything that's red or green or a color that may have a significant impact on them that could re-traumatize them. So be really, really thoughtful of your background and pay attention if your client sees something that's disconcerting or may cause them distress. Act on that, move the article out of the way. But yeah, you have to pay the same amount of attention in your virtual therapy room as you do in your face-to-face one.
Indeed, like it. So that is our digital counselling revolution. We're now going to be moving on to Practice Matters, where we look at something that affects the day-to-day running of a practice, and nothing affects or influences practice more than research. And Rory will be speaking to Emily Mitchell about research in online counselling.
Practice Matters.
And we welcome Emily Mitchell, who's produced a fabulous lecture on research in counselling, and not only research in counselling, but in a specific area, which is online and telephone counselling. So welcome, Emily, and just tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, Rory. I'm an integrative psychotherapist, so I'm based in Birmingham, London and Northern Cotswolds. So my approach really focuses on that relational, that in between, the dialogic. And it was fascinating to do some research last year about that online connection and how that relational aspect of the work translates through. It was something I didn't think would be so topical, but obviously as therapists we've been plunged into working online We could even say forced because of COVID-19. So it suddenly became very topical. And I think it's certainly the research I've done, it's been fascinating. I wasn't expecting some of that, the depth of relationship really to come out in what I did. But it's been really interesting.
So it sounds like you mentioned earlier the relationship, the dialogical part of the relationship. This was the basis of your research. What did you find about, say, if we use the term relational depth? What were the themes that came out of your research?
Yeah, again, really interesting. So what popped out is that relational depth is there. And it can be translated through cyberspace. So that the themes that came up, and my research is qualitative, so it actually explored that subjective lived experience of 6 very experienced integrative psychotherapists. That was interesting as well. And the themes that came out were what was seen and what was hidden. I think that's really important. I think a lot of people home in on that, the difference, and they instantly compare to the traditional in-person therapy. So it's really good to explore that. Intimacy and distance, so again, polarities, but then come together. And interestingly, you can still achieve that relational depth, is what I found, even working miles apart. And in some cases, it can actually feel more intimate because of the way it works. It's like almost seeing it as a different genre. So my participants started talking more about these things. And what's interesting, Rory, is that when I actually did the research, people were just starting to work more online. And I think we know as well, it's almost the research hasn't been done. There's been skepticism about the forum. And I'd even go so far to even say a bit of shame. There's some people that didn't really talk about doing online therapy. I think because what would colleagues think, even what would clients think? So there's a level of shame in the air. So actually, even in the research process, talking to the therapists, it's amazing to hear them come out more and more and actually begin to think about these relational aspects and gain confidence even when they were talking. So yes, intimacy and distance is one. Just open to connect, how we connect online and our openness and our attitude. I think that's huge as a therapist. Like I said, if there's a bit of shame there, that's going to translate through our skill set. How do we do when things don't go to plan? It's not quite the same as being in control in our therapy space. Also similar but different worlds. Constantly it was being compared, which it will be, to the traditional face-to-face. But what participants were able to talk about and what developed in the research was the fact that there was continuities, because there's the connection, but there are differences. So I think what sums it up fantastically is one of my participants talked about it being something different, something valuable, and then much more than second best. So that's what I called the research in the end, much more than second best. So yeah, these are the kind of themes that were coming out all the way through.
Yes, I think that's really interesting. You've hit on a point that I've picked up on quite a lot about people thinking that online therapy is somehow second best. It's a stopgap. It seems to me that your research bared that out a little bit until people maybe got into it or became understanding the difference. Yeah,
I think so. It's again, it's looking at how it is different. It's not expecting it to be the same. If you're expecting it to be the same, then those expectations probably aren't going to be met. And as I said, when the participants were talking, they almost left the interview thinking, gosh, this is quite exciting actually. I mean, what was happening has been terrible with COVID. But I think for therapists, it's been about trying to adapt, remain open, that hopefully we're good at, be reflexive throughout this process, and then be able to see the opportunities. For example, in the research, if we go back to the relationship now, the levels of depth were there. So, the participants talked about the transference being there, that counter-transference. Someone said, wow, I'm working with, I can feel their child right now, but they're 100 miles away.
Yes.
The reparative depth, the gaze that can be achieved online. One participant very articulately linked it to the mother's gaze or the lover's gaze, and how actually that can be created. The Working Alliance, it's almost more focused on process, I think, which allows you to work unconscious to unconscious as well. So fascinating things. It's very exciting.
Yeah, so more than a nod to Petrushka Clarkson there, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the intersubjective world. Was there anything that came out about effectiveness over age ranges at all?
I think that came out in certainly in being able to adapt to technology. So there are my participants talked about clients that were more open to work in the medium because it's just their world as well. So younger people, they're constantly on the telephones and constantly on the internet anyway. I think certainly in my experience as well, certain clients, especially when COVID-19 hit, there was a lot of skepticism about it because they're just not used to working online, or,
yes.
For example, Zoom's an absolutely alien concept to them. So, and that was interesting as well, because maybe we started off on the telephone, but then as time gone on, there was a need to see each other. The client wanted to see a visual, and then people were then warming up to that. But it's there was certainly, just from my experience, different levels of openness and willingness to work online, and that did seem to be affected by not just age but skill set and familiarity. And
yes, and I think you brought up a really interesting point. I think a lot of therapists could be wedded to the technology they use, but actually it's very possible, of course, that someone could start on the phone and then go onto a video, or vice versa, I guess.
Yeah, and I think again, it's as a therapist what you're coming with. So if you don't necessarily like talking on the phone, or you don't like a particular way of working, then that could translate through as well. But obviously all of this is about keeping your client and your orientation in the centre. I think that's really important. That's working creatively as well. So it can be a collaborative process. I think this is what came out in the research as well, is that actually the online environment does provide opportunities of working in different ways. For example, just talking about different what a client is attracted to in ways of working, working in different stages, like you said just then, Rory, about participants talked about some clients actually being quite traumatized by the mirroring. That could lead to possible trauma, previous relational trauma. So how do they then work with that person online and be creative? They talked about putting laptops side by side and then both client and therapist looking at a similar object. So yeah, it almost provides opportunities to work relationally and brings up things that might not have actually been in the therapy room if you hadn't had the opportunity to working via screens, so to speak.
Yeah, so in a way, online therapy develops its own techniques, its own genre, its own ways of working, and some of those wouldn't have been available if you'd have worked face-to-face.
No, I think another really interesting point is, sometimes a client can come into the therapy room very tidy, very neat. That's the script. But then seeing someone's background, you might just see a very different part of them. So that might be a little bit more chaotic, and it's all grist from the mill, really, and done in a relational, reflexive way, keeping your client at the centre of the work, obviously.
Absolutely, thinking about what's next and how you can work effectively with a client, how you can be I'm not going to use the word a better therapist. That's really a judgment label, but maybe how you can be a more creative therapist. And certainly I think the online world does lead to that. So I think the whole area of research around online therapy is super important. I think the lecture on your research was brilliant. I think it answers a lot of questions that people have about, can you achieve the same relational patterns online as you do face-to-face, and that fear of being second best. And I think the lecture answered that question conclusively. So Emily Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much to Emily Mitchell. And thank you, as always, to you, Rory. You take your time to seek out the people and to make the interview recordings that inform us, the listening audience. I'm grateful to you.
Well, thank you for that, Ken. And I hope that those who are listening really benefited from Emily's wisdom and of course, her research. So what an episode we had today. We started off by keeping in the client's frame of reference, a handout there for you to pick up, to help you to be able to pace and to be able to stay in the client's frame of reference. We moved into the digital counselling revolution, and we talked about backgrounds, the significance of them, and indeed a safety element. And then we finished, of course, with Emily Mitchell talking about research online research, a growing edge of research, and really, really important in this new world of counselling. So as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and hey, join the digital counselling revolution.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.